If the only goal is cost, then the supplier that's 2% more expensive but twice as green is going to be at a disadvantage. If it's not the only goal, then you begin to start bringing up something a lot more interesting.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Looking Outside. So after 200 years of rapid growth, we're seeing the consequences of putting the planet to the limits of habitability. But with endless growth ambitions and finite resources, it's time that we get climate action into the P&L. Today, we're talking about sizing the potential from climate solutions and capturing the economic risks and so much more with climate and sustainability leader, David Carlin. Huge welcome to the show, David.
Thanks so much, Joe. It's terrific to be here with you and really excited to talk about this.
So David and I met in person, actually, in Dubai at COP28, it was. So just about 2 years ago now.
Yeah, time really flies, especially in the sustainability space.
David's material is incredibly insightful, and that's why in Dubai I managed to corner you, David. I think it took us like an hour to find each other in a very, very hot climate and the like ginormous expo space in Dubai.
Yeah, it was a little bit of Marco Polo, but we made it work. So, amid the craziness of COP, it's always great to have chats like that.
Yeah, definitely. I was really happy to because, I've been following you for a while. So for anybody that doesn't know you, let's start with a little intro into who David is.
Wonderful. I'm David Carlin. I founded DA Carlin and Company, which works as a strategic advisor to governments, financial institutions, and corporates. I also created the Risk Center, a center for excellence at the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative. And before that, worked in management consulting and in financial risk over the course of my career. And now I have a variety of academic interests. I'm working at Cambridge and King's College on the intersection of sustainability and economics. And really what I try to do is help people see how sustainability can really be integrated into the operating model of their organization.
And so you're working across governments, private organizations, NGOs. Like, how broad does your work currently go?
It's fairly broad because I really think of this as a systems change problem. It's not something where we can push one variable and get to the solution. And I think that's why we've seen that blowback on things like recycling. We've seen that on carbon credits. We've seen that on so many things where we see this may have potential benefits, but it's not going to be the whole picture. And so part of this is helping governments create an enabling environment. Last year, I was the lead editor on a book for the new UK government on accelerating the transition. But really, a lot of that focus is with the private sector, with financial institutions on how they make that capital available. And then with the innovators themselves, there's about a dozen smaller firms that I'm working with who have either climate or fintech related solutions that aim to advance sustainability. And so my focus really is to try to see within the ecosystem where the biggest impact can be gleaned. And in certain contexts, it's going to be top down. In other cases, though, as I've seen it, it can be very much bottom up.
A lot of the work that you're doing now is in kind of that climate financial accounting. I know obviously you've done a lot of work on aiding the loss and damage fund.
So I've done a fair amount of work on thinking about mobilization of climate finance. I've been connected into questions of climate justice and the loss and damage fund, but also a lot of the work around funding for adaptation and resilience, as well as helping to grow carbon markets and reach many of our decarbonization commitments.
What's really refreshing is that now we are starting to see that focus on financial accounting of the climate impact and upside of some of the future opportunities and investment areas. So in the research that I did, though, it seemed like it was a fairly new space, like climate finance only really started in the early 2000s. Is it still a very kind of nascent growing area?
I think it's definitely really fast growing, and we can see this just in the quantity of finance being directed at these things, because indeed what we're doing, and there's always a bit of a kind of definition and how do you want to call it? Do you want to call it transition finance, as we're seeing some big asset managers do now, or do you want to call it climate finance, sustainable finance. But the main point is as the economic transition to a low carbon future really picks up, we're seeing increasing funding into transportation, into energy and power generation, but also into infrastructure and the buildings, real estate, and other elements. And so this is a field that is growing rapidly. It's growing rapidly both in terms of public money. You're seeing this from China, from Europe, from the US most recently, and likely to still persist at many of the state level within the United States. And so I think you're seeing both public and private sector moving toward this. The question becomes how much is just purely intentionality versus how much is reflective of just a changing economy. So because there's more demand for wind and solar, more money is going to flow into it. And that can be directed as we want that to happen, or it can be market based. But I think the two work in concert. And when we forget one for the other, we end up in a place that is harder to move.
And so, what do you think is one of the biggest drivers of this greater focus on climate finances and looking at new areas of investment? I mean, is it, I guess the obvious assumption or hypothesis would be that we're starting to see the economic losses start to impact in maybe surprising ways? Do people want to get ahead of that, or is it actually seen as a kind of a market growth opportunity?
I think you're kind of seeing two sides of the coin here, and those two sides exist both in terms of the transition itself, but also in terms of the physical effects we're seeing. We've obviously seen unprecedented flooding in a number of parts of the world. We've seen a particularly potent storm season in the North Atlantic over the last several months. We've seen wildfires in the last few years. The point is these things are a lot more obvious, but so are the shifts away. The decrease in demand for coal, I think, is not just a current trend, but one that is only accelerating. This question of where peak fossil fuels are going to come out, almost anyone who is willing to take a bet on that is going to say within the next few years. And so we are really at this inflection point in terms of markets. Tipping points are a term that we commonly use in the climate science community to talk about things like Greenland's ice melting or the Amazon dying back, but they're just as true on the transition side. And I think what's important in both cases is whenever there's systems change, understanding it and thinking about what things can be done advantageously, both to manage it, but also to benefit from it, I think becomes really the critical task of any leader today.
We definitely see the investment from inside of corporations and private organizations to create teams that are starting to account for this. I mean, a lot of businesses have, let's say, lofty goals around sustainability, and they generally kind of know what they need to do. But actually instigating that and putting that into your plans and accounting for that in the P&L and then tracking it accurately, like the tracking part in particular, all of this is really quite complex and new for organizations to have to resource for.
Yeah, I think this is something that you're hitting on that is talked about and still not fully appreciated. I was back at COP28 when we were talking. I also was speaking with the LinkedIn co-founder, Alan Blue, and he was speaking about the new report that LinkedIn had put out on green skills, and they issued another one around New York Climate Week this year. And the truth of the matter is we sometimes think about training and skills as being these softer things. It's, we bring up some application, we click, through the module, we do the quiz, and then, we're trained. And the reality though is this is learning a new operating system. And I'm sure all of us have had that old computer where you get the notification, it no longer will update. And companies in many fields are in danger of having that experience overall, which is to say, no, the update's not going to go through because you don't have the skills, you don't have the resources and human capital to pull it off. And I think that's where having not only the right knowledge, but the right incentives in place. I think we spend a lot of time, unfortunately, in the climate community and the sustainability community, talking a lot about the shoulds of people should do this, companies should do this. And all of that is great, but those are moral forces, whereas it's far easier to change incentives and to change knowledge. And again, it's not easy, but by comparison to changing, the underlying nature of things, I think that this is, to me, the route to effective change. But it really can only begin when you have informed leadership that prioritizes it and when you have incentives that are working. You think about someone working with a supplier. If the only goal is cost, then the supplier that's 2% more expensive but twice as green is going to be at a disadvantage. If it's not the only goal, then you begin to start bringing up something a lot more interesting.
Are we starting to see cost parity in some of the sustainability solutions from suppliers, innovations, platforms? It feels like a lot of these things are growing in scale and are becoming a more viable alternative.
Yeah, I think that they definitely are. There's in some cases that kind of green premium, not to be confused with the greenium, but the added cost of doing this. But in many cases, that's no longer the way things are, and it may be in terms of how we heat our home. It may be in terms of how we get around. It may be in terms of what sort of power is provided to an urban area. But we are seeing in many cases the challenge is that these are systems that are incredibly complex and convoluted in many cases. You have to think about this in the literal sense of stringing up wires. Anyone who's ever had a fuse blow at their house, and usually it makes a lot more sense to call someone in because unless you're a qualified electrician, you risk doing some more damage. But imagine that system multiplied millions of times, and you begin to see the fact that even having the right projects in place, the right cost, doesn't necessarily guarantee the speed of progress that you need. The irony is the US has enough projects in the queue right now on the energy side to reach the 2030 goals that the Biden administration set. However, nobody is particularly optimistic that all of those projects will get greenlit. And that's not for political reasons, that's really for administrative reasons. And it's not just simply, as much as we talk about having a magic wand and cutting the red tape. There aren't enough people with the skills to approve. And once they have those skills, then having the other people go out and build these things. So in some ways, we're trying to find where we're most rate limited. But I think this is to me like a great thing that you've hit on, which is at the end of the day with cost parity, many cases cost may be the decisive factor, but in other cases it may be an operational constraint, it may be a regulatory constraint, it may be a demand constraint. I might have the cheapest meals in town, but if nobody wants to come to my restaurant, I'm not going to sell many of them. And I think that it's important to recognize what the constraint to progress is, because sometimes I sometimes would criticize the financial actors for this of when finance is the solution, everything looks like a finance problem. And I think that in many cases, it's knowing what the right challenge is. And at a national level or regional level, those things are going to differ depending on what tech we're talking about, depending on what need we're talking about. But yeah, to answer that initially, I think a lot of these things have achieved, if not cost parity, in many cases, cost advantage. And that may be with or without incentives.
Yeah, well, you got me thinking also about the push pull that you need in some of these, like, particularly if you're trying to transform categories and industries, is you do need an affordable solution, but you also need that food to taste amazing and to deliver on a great customer experience. And that's, I think, what a lot of, at least in the private sector, what a lot of organizations are really making sure that they prioritize in that kind of sustainability aspiration, or some of the planning that they do is let's not compromise on the customer experience or the familiarity that consumers know of our products. Like, we don't want them to have to trade off too much. So then it's okay, then internally, how much are we willing to trade off to get them a more sustainable solution? And all of that is just so complex, going back to what we were saying before. Do you feel like the consumer openness to trade-offs, or like consumers changing their habits, is that a lever that organizations can pull to try to instigate some change here?
So I really think it is, but I think it's a little bit more subtle. I on that notion of push pull, I think what you tend to see quite a lot is a very all or nothing thinking, which is not really the right way of considering it, which is the kind of more fossil fuel approach of, well, this is entirely demand driven. And so if people want to drive big cars, we can't make them not drive them. We're going to supply it. The other side, there's the kind of we have no agency, we just pick up the things that are put in front of us. I can't choose where to put my money in a retirement account because everyone's doing the same thing. So I just, I know my money is contributing to climate breakdown, but I can't do anything about it. So on both ends of the spectrum, you have this kind of absolutism. And I think the reality where companies really can play and what's really exciting is in between, because I think you have more than ever before consumer awareness and consumer preference. And in many industries that aren't terribly differentiated in terms of products, think about, finance, because, there isn't the physical product. How do you differentiate your firm from another in terms of a retail service? It's going to be in that customer relationship, which we all know. That's why, every bank talks about being your friendly neighborhood bank, even if it has a trillion in assets. But the other part is, can this be a real differentiator if you're not going to be competing on cost, because cost is tied to the rate you're getting, then that can be a really important part of this. The other thing is also catering to a market where these things are demanded, and they can be incentivized demand in the sense of, well, it just makes sense for us to put in heat pumps. So who's going to be
Mm.
producing and installing those heat pumps? Or, okay, well, it just makes sense for us to switch to a smart meter because it's saving us money. And so the reasons for consumer preference shifts can change. I think it's very fair to say never before has there been more awareness and interest in doing this. But I think sometimes that bumps up against the, oh, because people care, they're willing to do all of these things. And the answer is still what it's always been for every business, which is if you want people to do it, make it as easy as possible and as well integrated into their routine as possible. I think this is the brilliance of the drive-through is the kind of great example, right? Of you're on the road, but you need to eat. What is the way to make it the easiest possible to do this thing? And it doesn't mean that everyone will opt for the easiest possible but when it comes to mass adoption, when it comes to mass change, even if it may save me money to put solar panels on my roof, if it means I'm going to have to be out of my house for 2 months, even if I will make money off that, that might not be something I'm willing to do. And so I think we as companies should be thoughtful about what the consumer interests are and how climate adds to the list of preferences that people have always had. Price,
Mm.
quality, community, relationships, all of these
Mm.
things that really tie into consumption decisions.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that you called that out as well, that it's not an absolutist solution that we should have. I mean, I think a lot of people, a lot of consumers feel like, well, I'm willing to take the extra step or to pay a little bit more, but I just don't trust that the right thing is going to be done at the other end. I know a lot of people that I speak with around Chicago, they say, well, I'm not going to recycle because I know that it ends up in landfill anyway. So in many cases, the buck does stop with the organization or the government body or whatever it might be to then follow through with the commitments that they set to make sure that that kind of loop is closed. So I mean, you talk about this as well. I know it's an ecosystem, right? Where the collaboration, the partnership, the follow through needs to happen at all parts of that ecosystem.
I think that's like a big piece of this, which is that if you're not thinking in a systemic way, you're gonna really end up having a hard time with the approaches that you actually want to bring about, because what you're going to start to see is, okay, well, changing that factor, it's a little bit of that baking analogy that if you're trying to make a cake, you can have some leeway with certain ingredients, but others you can't. You might be able to add an extra couple tablespoons of sugar. You probably can't double the amounts of baking powder without changing the consistency. And so I think companies should think systemically. You're not going to be able to capture everything, but this is where discussions around things like materiality, which we hear all the time in reporting, become really relevant, not just as a term for regulatory reporting, but actually for your own decision making. How do you try to get the most important things and focus on them and say these are the key factors we're going to be shaping? But I think your point's a particularly good one as well, that there's going to be not only shifts in preferences, but also recognition that the ways those shifts will take place maybe different in different consumer segments, maybe different in different markets, and each may push and pull on the other. Very rarely do people say, oh, well, this is why I'm paying more for this. It just becomes, no, actually, it's the underlying, the intermediate good that's costing more. It may be, and I think this credibility piece also is super important, which is if I don't believe the thing is the genuine article, why pay more or why pay less? I think you might even find the paradox that I don't want to be tainted by association. And so
Mm.
credibility to me is incredibly important because of what an information rich age we live in.
And I guess that also applies to some of the government tracking and reporting systems as well as the kind of a government reassessment of what is the most credible sustainability initiative platform tracking reporting that we should have. And a part of the reason that popped into my head is because I wanted to ask you about the EU's corporate sustainability reporting kind of changes that they're now wanting to implement and how they're shifting their program, reporting program slightly. Is that kind of a part of this kind of broader transition of financial reporting for climate? Is that we're still working out the best way to track and report and be credible?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of change that is going to be seen, and some of it is due to political winds shifting. It would be an omission to ignore those things, both in the United States, but also in Europe and other jurisdictions. But I think there's also a recognition that we would love to have all the information, but we won't have that. And in many cases, any forward-looking business decision operates under uncertainty. If you already knew, you wouldn't have a risk department. If you already knew, you wouldn't keep reserves because you would know what you want to put your chips down on. And so uncertainty is kind of the basic condition. It's like gravity or any other law of the universe. It operates in the business world, and I think that what becomes important though to just think about is, given that this is a question of information, it becomes very much an input output. How much effort does it take to put this stuff in, and what are we getting out of it? And the who that is are the regulators themselves. Can they make more informed decisions about the state of progress on policy? Can they manage risks better? The other stakeholders, can I have a clearer view of who is actually green and who is greenwashing? Can I have a clearer sense of how internally I can act because by gathering this information, I now have newer insights into our behavior and our strategy. So I think right now one thing we're struggling with is we've put now a fairly high input burden, but one of the questions is, are we seeing that value for output? And in some cases, and this kind of comes from the world of AI, this idea of the minimum viable prediction. What is the least piece of information that we need in order to improve the prediction? And I think more and more you're seeing regulators, as I said, for a variety of reasons, some political, some practical, but beginning to say, some of this information is duplicative. Some of this information is not always so additive. And so I don't see this as a backsliding in Europe on sustainability commitments or prioritization of sustainability, but rather a bit of a refinement of the same way we would when we go on a big trip and we have our packing list. Then you realize, maybe I don't need two umbrellas. That might have been a nice idea, but no, actually, I think we're overpacked a little bit. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to go on the trip. It doesn't mean you don't care about getting wet, but it's that same notion, I think, here with sustainability is it should be optimizing that ratio. You want it to be as easy and painless to do and as informative. Think of this almost like the blood test. If we can, just with, that little pinch, be able to get all that information about financial health, then super. But if it is going to take, you being laid up in the hospital, then and I think that this is what we're seeing in Europe. And I think more and more jurisdictions will reach this because as much as this isn't a problem that the markets can solve themselves, Sir Nicholas Stern talked about this as the greatest market failure in history is climate change, but it's also not a problem that regulators alone can solve. And so it is the two, getting back to that notion of systems thinking, that we need to be considering how those pieces fit together.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. And the other thing that stood out to me was when Sir Nicholas Stern said that we risk damages on a scale larger than the two world wars of the last century, which leads me to, really sizing the true impact of, I guess, climate inaction or the consequences of, extreme weather events, all of these things that are impacting us. And I know you said before it's a question of information, and when it comes to the future, the only certainty is uncertainty, as you said. So we're working with incomplete data essentially because we don't know exactly what the future might hold. So how do you guide organizations or corporations or individuals to think about anticipating those impacts of climate change that are non-linear, non-obvious, and potentially a little bit lacking in the full complete picture or all of the data that we would want about the future?
This is so key because we don't have perfect information about the future, and even more confoundingly, this is I think something that I always smile about when I talk to friends who are building out many of the climate models is we are the biggest source of uncertainty. Our behaviors, of course, the climate itself has some major uncertainties when it comes to tipping points, but our behavior, we can model out what would happen if, but that if is a little bit of the case of the politically possible, of the technologically feasible, of the economically desirable, and of the consumer preference. And so in a lot of ways, we are trying to hit a moving target because we're talking about things. And we see this all the time when big complex models get badly out of step because of even a small number of inputs being out of date. So one example is with a lot of climate models, a lot of the high warming scenarios anticipated massive growth in coal use. Why? Because in the post-financial crisis recovery in China, China used an incredible amount of coal. It still does, but that growth has totally leveled off by comparison. And so using those old growth assumptions, it's the same as a population assumption from the 1960s, assuming that the world will have 100 billion people by 2200. We see that when we don't get the shape of the curve and the trend correct, we end up really being off. But what I would say though is many of these changes are ones that are interlinked, and I always say it's about the state of the system rather than about the total. It's a wind of 20 miles an hour or a sudden gust is probably not going to have any major consequences unless you're perched on the edge of a cliff, in which case it's going to be pretty destructive. And so consequences tie into this paradigm that the climate science community talks about risk really being this factor of vulnerability and likelihood and exposure all together in terms of how much is exposed, how vulnerable, how much of a harm would be done, and how likely is that event to happen. Sometimes you can see those low likelihood, high impact events. Other times you can see, well, everyone's going to be affected by this in a marginal way. And that may actually, something like lower productivity due to heat stress may actually be one of the things that costs the most money, whereas we see more stories about hurricanes and fires. And yet and so all of that to say, I would think about the numbers of just over the last decade, the world has lost about 2 trillion to climate driven disasters. And that number is only expected to increase. There's no school of thought where that slows down under really any emissions trajectory over the next decade or so. I think the big question is once we start to bring into play human systems, when there are questions of state failure, of migration, when there are questions of ecosystem collapse, so getting into biodiversity, these are where we begin to see not just the 9 tipping points that we've seen in the popular press, which has been some really terrific work on that, but really dozens more of how much of a tipping point is it before food prices are unaffordable in this region? How much of a tipping point until this particular forest is no longer able to retain enough moisture to conserve itself? We can do that at the level of the Amazon or the Congo, but what about subsidiary rainforests that have big effects on weather patterns? And so all of this to say, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, but in this case, uncertainty is not necessarily our friend. And right now, I would say a lot of global action on climate change amounts a little bit like scratching lottery tickets as our policy rather than saving for retirement or buying insurance. Everything we know tells us that the bad events, the risky events are more likely. And so while we can put a number on it, I shy away from that a little bit only because when those numbers get put on it, they can be pretty quickly taken apart as ridiculous, either because they're massive underestimates. We've seen that with some of the simpler models from William Nordhaus and others, or because they become so big that it almost isn't worth talking about. Saying 90% of the economy is dependent on something is pretty much tantamount to saying it's the entire planet. And so I think that it's really recognizing how do we prepare and how do we reckon with something that is one of its challenging features is that this is not an easy problem to size. If it were a problem that were big enough right now, we would say, okay, this is what we need to do. But by the time it's big enough for us to deal with today, which I would argue it is, it may be getting too late to do anything. It's the waiting around until you have a heart attack to deal with your high cholesterol. It's certainly going to be a good time to do it then, but damages may have occurred. And I think that to me, an article I had written for Forbes was making this point that as we pass 1.5, we are increasingly getting the severe symptoms as well. And we're doing maybe a lot of damage that we're not necessarily seeing. So just because you keep looking at those numbers of emissions and temperature, you may be missing those underlying ones that actually really support the system itself.
In that Forbes article as well, which if you're happy to share that, I'll link that into the show notes for anyone that wants to take a read. You do mention I think this is the general consensus in the climate community, right? The window for 1.5 is likely to close for good. And a lot of the things that you mentioned before are pretty scary. And generally, when sustainability teams inside of organizations try to share this message, to their leadership teams, and ultimately the buck stops with the leadership teams, there's a sense of urgency, there's a sense of dystopia, of helplessness that this is getting worse. And yet it does feel like a lot of organizations are going about BAU, like they're immune somehow to all of these things that are happening to the world, but their organization is insulated from that in some way. Are you seeing that the kind of that fear message and shaking organizations to say, no, you are not immune to this, this will impact you, you need to start accounting for this, is effective? Or is it actually a kind of maybe not aiding the cause because the kind of the fear is a demotivator in many ways?
I think it's hard to scare people into action that is lasting and long term. This is the kind of, fire and brimstone preacher model of, it's probably good for collecting donations when you go around on a Sunday. It's probably not a great way to get people to stop sinning. And I think there's a little bit of that truth there. There should be a real sense of consequences, because if people don't have the agency that there's the if then, if I do this, then this is more likely or less likely to happen, then, they're in a position where nothing matters. And that can be despair of, well, everything's going to fall apart anyway, or just current ambivalence. Well, nothing's changing, so why should we change? And I think it is getting to that right level of impact. But I think it comes down to, and this is what I try to spend a lot of time with leaders on, is talking through with them, okay, this is how the change is going to happen. And these are the things we maybe don't know about it in terms of magnitude, in terms of others' responses. But I think what tends to click for people about some of these things is it gives us a lot of humility when we look at past financial crises, when we look at past economic cycles, to say, let's leave aside this sustainability and climate thing, because I think sometimes people treat it differently. They say, oh, well, that's not a real issue. The point is that non-payment of subprime mortgages in the United States is also a non-issue for, growth in China until it was. And I think because the world is interconnected, we have to really be humble with, we are pretty bad at predicting the next economic cataclysm, whether that is something like COVID, whether it's something like the global financial crisis. And what that means is, if we have things that are going to potentially not increase the likelihood necessarily, but increase certainly the magnitude, and in some cases, indeed, the likelihood, then I think what we need to do is take a bit of that humility and say, I think we actually should be concerned about this because we've gotten it wrong enough. If we predicted everything before, I don't need to talk to you about climate. Just keep doing what you're doing. You'll already have taken it into account because that's just the smart thing to do. But I think when you get out of this climate is a problem kind of conversation and into a what this does for the more mathematical amongst people I speak to say, this is really playing with the shape of the distribution of risk that you're going to face. It is going to make that amplitude higher, so those losses are going to hit harder, and they may hit at different and perhaps more frequent times than otherwise. And are you able to weather those things? It's kind of like saying, we're out on the sea, is this craft suitable for 2 meter waves? How about 5 meter waves? How about if the occasional 10-meter wave comes by? It's those questions that are important to ask, before the boat capsizes. And I think to me, the humility comes from the fact that we haven't gotten it right. We've repeatedly missed the boat on the magnitudes and timings. And what that tells me is when another factor comes in, that we can see a clear link to other risks, to other changes, I think it becomes important not to try to do our modeling because we're being asked to from a regulator perspective or out of interest, but really to say, if we're actually going to work this in, getting back to that cake, this ingredient is going to be critical to what our future looks like. And I think that that's where successful companies are going and will continue to go. But you see this borne out already in companies that have struggled. You see this borne out in any transition, whether it's a transition to, e-commerce, whether it's a transition to globalized workforces. Anytime there's this big sea change in a literal and figurative sense here, that is going to be what happens. Companies are going to get caught out and they're not going to expect it. And you say, well, how could you have not expected to be undercut by e-commerce retailers? Well, ask some of the big companies that went under and you'll find a very similar story to the one you're going to hear with climate and the transition.
So, based on what you just said, then I think that you're right that a lot of the times, even when we do have signs of what's coming, we are very good at ignoring them, of hiding under the bed or escaping into our phones or ignoring what's happening. I think that the greatest organizations are the ones, whether it's e-com or other examples we've seen in the past, where they're able to adapt their business models to a changing, climate, a business climate in this case, or to be a lot more proactive. And so the information that we're now gathering in that climate space is helping organizations and leaders to be more proactive by having the very best, most credible, most accurate information of what's actually happening in the world, and then deciding whether to act on it or not act on it. So all of this, I think, is really a really critical point that you make around helping organizations to really think differently about how they can navigate some of the complexity in the world. How do we incentivize people to feed this into their business models, to upskill their people, to be able to account for these things better? And I think that this is one thing that we are starting to see is shareholder interest, investor interest, greater visibility of the bottom line, greater accounting that's helping the shareholders or the CEOs to be incentivized to invest in some of these areas of opportunity. Is that something that you're seeing?
I think we're beginning to see those things happen, but honestly, and it's funny because going back years to the creation of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the first pillar in that being governance, and talking about, how the board and executives are remunerated, and does that take into account climate? And you can broaden that out to sustainability now with new disclosure standards. But it's a very easy question to put in a report because the answer is just a yes or a no. And maybe the yes, there's a few paragraphs. So it's one of the easiest things to write down, but I think one of the most deeply seated elements of why we're in the situation we're in. One piece of research I was batting around last year was looking at for various fund managers if their compensation wasn't your traditional 2 in 20, or, if it wasn't, their 1 in 10 of kind of that management fee and success, but instead was about maintaining a portfolio above a certain level for a certain number of years, or outperforming this benchmark. And if you tied compensation, what things would get held versus what things wouldn't. And you start to see that so much of the architecture that appears externally comes from the incentives internally. And so I think that is really true when it comes to executives. You say, oh, well, we're tying their pay to it. But do they care? Is this something that is economically meaningful to them? And similarly, are they rewarded not just in terms of absolute, but in relative terms? If this is going to make a minimal difference for me, then will I really go for it? And similarly, it's that idea of trying to change those trains to slightly different tracks. You're going to get to a very different destination if you take a different track, but those incentives are the tracks. And I think right now what we see is a lot of discussion of, well, we need to do this, but much more of it is, to my mind, about completeness and compliance. So it's, well, you're on the line. And in many ways, that has been the way things have been since 2008. And that is better governance, no question, for the firms that do that. But it isn't really changing the operating model. If you're still going to, for example, with a relationship manager, if you're still going to incentivize them to book more business, they're going to book more business rather than manage risk. If and so you have to think what ultimately drives the decision. And I think that incentive is going to be the one that we really need to look at, not just as something we put in the report, but actually to say, this is the system setting. Like this is the one that really actually makes the difference. As I said, what is going on internally is very much reflected externally.
And this being a really pivotal step in greater compliance. We talked about credibility, risk, kind of mitigation and management. So I guess the more opportunity generating or revenue generating part of that kind of P&L part of how climate feeds into business is opportunity generation and innovation. So I know that particularly on your LinkedIn, you're constantly showcasing a lot of innovations that are coming through in that climate space. And there's a lot of really exciting stuff that's emerging. So I guess from what you're seeing, I'm curious, are there, a couple of innovations that you think are really going to not just be beneficial to climate action, but also be financially beneficial for organizations? Is there anything interesting that you're seeing?
I mean, on the one hand, the energy sector is just growing at such pace, with low carbon energy sources being really not only at a rate that is historically fast, but at a level that the International Energy Agency projects that by 2034, solar will be the biggest provider of electricity globally. So we're talking about within 9 years, a huge sea change. It's leaping over many of the legacy fossil fuels. And I think that that's really dramatic because it is something that is not only been a trend, but been something that has gathered steam. It's one thing when you 3x or 5x or 10x something from a really low base, but once you start talking about several percent of global capacity, once that starts growing, 20, 30% year on year, you're really talking about the quantities that we're starting to see. I mean, China hit its renewable installation goal for 2030 last year. And so that is a space where you're going to see a huge amount of demand growth in emerging markets for energy, in some cases doubling, even trebling of energy, and in other countries, total changeovers in the grid. And then I would say on the tech side, there's a huge market, in my opinion, not just on the data and reporting side, that's the limited edge of it, but really on the use of information, especially around AI and machine learning for optimization. So how can we get more out of our systems? How can we identify supply chain risks earlier in a more volatile world? Cutting that downtime to lower levels is going to be key. But also on a financial side, am I paying for policies that don't protect me? A lot of big organizations have insurance policies, and those cover real assets. And that might be great. But if you're a dairy provider and the power goes out, well, there hasn't been any damage to the real asset. It's just been that your goods have been ruined. Or if you're a fulfillment center and the roads are flooded, well, you're not going to get that business interruption covered. So I think to me that approach also provides huge opportunities. Everyone knows that, AI is big and growing fast, but there's also opportunities for massive transparency gains. Blockchain technologies, which are most now associated with cryptocurrencies, can also bring clarity and transparency to supply chains that have been hitherto opaque. And so, how we see where a product went from, this gives us credibility in the claims. It allows us to take advantage of incentives at each stage. It also allows trade policies to progress. So, I think those kind of rails that the 21st century economy is going to be increasingly built on are 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 really beginning to come up and be central. I'd also say and mention that there's probably a really big opportunity in the resiliency and infrastructure side. It's not always as sexy, but the fact is, so many communities, so many places are going to need improvements, and ideally ones that balance both emissions reductions with resiliency. But those are going to be the kinds of things that are really key if we're actually going to get to the goals that we need. And so the built environment, it's so massive. There's so much work to do, and it's so long lived that two-thirds of the buildings that will be there in 2050 have already been built. So this really means getting those hard yards. It's exciting, some of the things I talked about before, AI, machine learning, blockchain, but that stuff is, the light and fast, the kind of invisible rails. The physical rails are the ones that we also need to consider, the real physical world that we live in.
The way that you approach it is so broad and it's so future focused, like you're talking about projections for the next decade, probably the next 3 decades, and you're really looking at this from a very kind of balanced perspective. I guess I'm wondering, how does that go down when you're speaking to a CFO or to someone who is, like generally economists are a lot more, interested in the constant and the certainty, and how does that go? Like, do you get a lot of pushback?
I think people tend to be really interested in it for the most part. When you find the right angle and the right topic, it becomes this kind of, oh, that's really interesting. Tell me more. And then the questions that most people ask really get into, okay, but what do we do with this? Because it's a little bit of me telling you it's going to rain tomorrow. I was like, well, so do you want me to bring an umbrella? Like, what's
Hmm.
the implication for us? And that to me is like the really exciting bit, like where the gears start turning, where you say, okay, what could your organization start doing in that context? I find that very few people, once you actually lay it out to them, sort of step by step, really, disbelieve. They're like, oh, that's not going to happen. It's quite different than, the sort of general climate doomerism of, oh, the world is going to end. It's, well, I can dispute that. Or I could say, like, I'm looking around, it's a nice day out, and, I don't see that. Once people begin to see that cause and effect, then it becomes, okay, so what about for us? What actually matters? And that becomes both a question of strategy, but also, as I said, a question of skills and resourcing to say, it's great to tell you what to do, but you're going to also have to find the people who will carry it through unless you're a one-man band.
Yeah, and I think it's great as well that organizations now have someone like you, David, to lean on to help them to navigate a lot of these things and to really look across broader implications or opportunities for their business. So it's been an absolute pleasure to talk through a lot of these things that you've been observing and seeing and sizing. So thank you so much. I do have one last question for you before I let you
Of
go.
course.
And of course, theme of the show. What's your go-to when you're trying to gain a fresh perspective on all of these things that you already know inside out?
Well, I feel like the one thing I'll challenge you a little bit on is I certainly there's few things that I truly know inside and out because of the speed at which this space is changing and just because of its massive complexity. So even as I'm learning, I sometimes say I'm just 30 minutes faster when it comes to when somebody will come up to me about a post on LinkedIn. I'll say, no, I just read that report, 2 days ago. That's how I know. That's how I saw it. But I think for me, and this is something I think you'll be happy to hear, especially in this context of the future and sustainability, is I really find being outside, being in motion to be one of the best ways, not only for my emotional well-being and to clear my head, but to really pour over new thoughts. There's the let me get down to it and start writing, but very often now, the last few months, I've been recording voice notes or just really kind of working over a problem in that gentle way of I can't just stare it down, but rather I can put it in my pocket and when I reach back in, it's like, oh. And I think that really does have a lot to do with our wiring just as creatures as well, that being out, being in motion, those things really help to pick over a problem. There's a story I'd heard of, Einstein used to like to do this. He also liked to play violin. I gave up the violin in third grade, so that isn't much of an option for me. But I also just think being changed by the things that you read and hear, it's yes, the kind of canonical keep an open mind, but it's I think more than that, a bit of a scientific approach to the world as well. Of as new information comes in, you're constantly updating your priors. Think about yourself a little bit like you're a telescope trying to triangulate on a particular site in the sky, and you're moving around, and the more information you get and as it moves and you move, you're constantly doing a bit of that updating, and rarely are you going to swing around completely. But I think that if you don't do any of that, it does beg the question of did you get anything new out of what you were looking at? So I think those two things, being in motion and being outside, along with just trying to take that more scientific approach to how does this change the evidence I have? I think those are things that I recommend to anyone, hope are helpful to them.
Yeah, I love that. David, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you so, so much for sharing all of your insight and coming on the show.
No, it's been my pleasure, Joe. It's great to get a chance to chat with you today, and really looking forward to some of your future episodes as well.